the idea of innovate inside the box is really, there's always going to be constraints, there's always going to be issues, and we need to continuously change the box and push the boundaries of what the constraints are and what it is. But also, and my co-author of Innovate Inside the Box, Katie Novak, said something really powerful to me. And I think this is something we have to remember. She said distinctly, she said, those students in grade 3 this year, this is it. This is their 1 year in grade 3. So we got to figure out, and I think this is really imperative of leadership, to not only to embody this, but instill this mindset into their staff, is that this is the 1 year in grade 3. How do we make sure this is the best experience for these kids in that year ever? And I think that's something that really drives them work. And like I said, it's not saying that things aren't bad in some situations, and we have to continuously push and advocate, for our kids and for our colleagues. But it is to ensure that we do everything we can in our power to create the best opportunities for our kids. And just a little bit of personal with me, this is my daughter, Kalia, and I'm a really proud dad. And really, really drives everything I do, all the work that I do. And, I think that as a dad, you're always asked, like, will things change you, when you become a parent? I don't think I've changed my philosophy. I've just become more committed to it, because the thing is that when I see my own daughter, and I think this is a really important aspect of, what we do in education and as a parent, she is a very smart kid. She's a very brilliant kid. But the thing that I don't know, and this is really important for me to identify, is I have no idea if she's going to be academically gifted. And there's a really subtle difference between what I just said, and that, like, some of the smartest kids in your school today are terrible academically. And what we need to focus on is, and this is something I always talk about with my own daughter, is that that's something that we don't necessarily have control over in some aspects. Obviously we teach to, for our kids to do well in the work that we do. But the things that I know that we have control over in education is the idea that if my daughter were to come to your school, would she feel valued? Would she feel welcome? Would she feel appreciated? And would she feel that if she were actually to miss a day of school in your organization, would she feel her contributions would be sorely missed? And will you look at what her strengths are, or will you just look at what she can't do? And so I think that when we look at, I know that probably many people, I can't see the chat right now, but I know many people are parents. For me, one of the standards when I look at, the educators I work with, my first thing is, like, would I want my daughter in your classroom? Would I want my own kids in your school? And I think this is something that's really important to me, because, like I said, she's a gifted kid. She's very talented, but I don't know if she could be academically gifted. We have to just start distinguishing those two things. And I think for me, when we look at the idea of success, we often define it for our kids. And what's really important is we need to get our students in on those conversations, that what does success mean to them? Because every participant in this chat right now could actually see, could have, feel very successful in whatever way they perceive. But your definition of success and my definition could be totally two different things, and it's no different with their students. And so just something, you kind of see this is kind of what drives me in my work. But I know that many of you are new to your organizations and to your schools. And I'm kind of known as the change guy. I've had a blog for the last 10 years. It's called The Principle of Change. It was focused on change. And the thing that I often get asked by new administrators is that if you were to brand new to a school, what is the first thing you would change? And I hope this is a really helpful, and I know that we're a few months into the school year, and I hope this is helpful. The thing that I say over and over again to people when I'm asked this question is, what would I change? Nothing. There's nothing I would change in a school. The first thing I would do is I know this is kind of a weird thing to say, I would actually create a spreadsheet. And what I do with the spreadsheet is I would actually write the name of every staff member on my staff. And to the right of that column, what I would actually do is I would write the column is called strength. And what I would do is nothing changes in my building, in my district, until, I should say in my school, until I know the strength of every person in that building. And they know I know their strength. And I think that really distinguishing thing I just said is really important. It is not enough to value people. People need to know they're valued, because a lot of times there is a disconnect between the two. Because if you go in there trying to change things without valuing people first and they don't feel valued, they're going to fight you the entire time. But if you go and people know they're valued and you're just trying to help them get even better to reach, new heights, they'll work with you the whole way. And so I think that a lot of times we go into new buildings, we see things right away that we're like, oh, this has got to change, this has got to change, this has got to change. But we need to take our time and really, show value in the work that we actually, of the people that we do. And so kind of one of the things I'm going to talk about today is this idea of the innovator's mindset and how we innovate inside the box and really what's the core of that? What does that mean? And when we talk about the idea of innovation, a lot of times people will highlight stuff. They'll highlight hey, we got maker spaces, we got this technology, we got this. And when you focus on the idea of innovation and you talk about the stuff, you're focused on the wrong thing. When I talk about innovation, my focus is what are the people I'm serving doing? What am I doing that is actually creating something new and better? And the idea of this was actually, a lot of it was kind of in this idea, and this quote from Thomas Friedman. He was talking in an article in what Google looks for in employees. And what he said in this, they weren't talking about grades. And if you actually look, I know Ontario has some different hiring practices for whatever reasons. But when I hired people as a principal, we never looked at grades. They were never a factor. And I'm sure that everyone, in this that's listening or part of this, broadcast right now, they all know someone who, let's just use the idea of math. They know the math teacher who is brilliant at math who can't teach math. We know there's other skills there. So in this article, they're talking about what are the skills that Google's looking for, and it's not grades, it's flexibility, humility, how you adapt to change, how you work with other people. And this quote, "The world only cares what pays off and you can do with what you know, and it doesn't care how you learned it," is something that really kind of distinguishes what I'm talking about, what I'm sharing. And many schools, and I know in Ontario and across the world, will talk about the idea of growth mindset. And I think the distinguishing is that growth mindset is really important to the work that we do, but I try to take it a step further, this idea of the innovator's mindset. And this is simply, the way I define it, is the belief that abilities, intelligence, and talents are developed so that they lead to the creation of new and better ideas. So really easily, I'm not looking for kids only to be good at math. I'm looking for kids to be able to do something with the math they have learned. And I know math's a really hot topic in Ontario, it has been for years. And I think that one of the pushbacks, and I'm sure you're getting this from communities, you've seen this, is that there is this fight about the idea of the back to basics camp versus kind of the new school of math. And really how I've distinguished this is that we're not ignoring the basics. We've never ignored the basics in math. We're just knowing that we need to go way beyond, especially with the access to the work that we have to do. And I think that's something that kind of bridges those two camps. And I think, it's not a one or the other. It's actually why both are important. And so what I've talked about is this in the innovator's mindset are these characteristics. And these things that we see is really important to embodying this, how are we reflective, empathetic, problem finders. And I'm not really going to get into this part as much, but what we've created in this new framework is this idea of this core of innovative teaching and learning. And you can see on the outside all of these characteristics. And working with Katie Novak, what we've talked about in the book is the idea of how do we do this through universal design for learning. But what we're going to focus on today is what I call the core. And the core is these 4 areas. And what you'll see in the middle is the idea of relationships. And I distinguish this importantly because when we talk about relationships, I am distinctly saying this is more important than the other 3 there on the outside. That if I do not build those relationships where I know the students in front of me, I know who they are, I know what drives them, I know the people I serve, then these other things are really hard to get to. And so I'll talk about also creating empowered learning experiences, the idea of learner-driven, evidence-informed practice, and educators master learner. So that's where I'm going to go with this conversation today. But I know there's probably some questions, so I'm going to let Matt just interrupt me. Is there anything that I can address? Is there any questions that you have, Matt, that I can address right now?
Not many at the moment, George. The one I'm seeing mainly right now is, can empathy be learned or taught? There's a little bit of a conversation going on in the chat right now.
Yeah, and I think creating opportunities where I think it can be taught in some perspectives, right? I think, for example, doing writing activities where we try to understand the viewpoint of someone else and try to put ourselves in the shoes of someone else. And I think that's one of the things that we try to actually create in our work. And when I share these characteristics, none of them are meant to be work in isolation. So, for example, the idea of empathetic and problem finders and solvers goes together beautifully. And there's actually a really great example they share in the book. Her name is Natalie Hampton, and she actually created what is called the Sit With Us app. And I think she's about 15 years old. And what this app did, and it was really interesting, she had experienced kind of going from school to school to school because of her family situation, which I'm not fully aware, but I just know that was part of her path. And one of the things she struggled with was going into a new class, a new school, and not knowing anyone, and moving into a school cafeteria, and the fear of actually sitting at a table where people didn't know her and maybe not accept her to sit with us, right? And because she experienced that, she actually, and this ties into the problem finding idea, she actually decided that she was going to invent an app where you could actually utilize this app, walk into a cafeteria, and students would actually identify tables that we wanted to actually, that were like welcoming and, please come sit with us. And so you can see the kind of the empathy and the problem finder idea kind of mesh there. And what we do, in the book is we talk about each characteristic in the second part. The first part is on the core of innovative teaching and learning, which I'm going to discuss today. But in the second part, what we talk about is each characteristic, why it's so important to what we do. And we share examples of students doing it and also strategies of how you could do that in your classroom through the use of universal design for learning. And so I think really kind of go back to the original question, like, can empathy be taught? I think, sharing examples of students already doing this work and why it's so important is actually a great way to model this, because I think a lot of times we talk about it from the sense of like, what teachers do, but actually not necessarily showing students. And that's one of the things that we try to cover. So is there any other questions, Matt, or should I continue?
I believe that's it for now, George.
Okay. And so, like I said, I'm gonna talk about this idea of the core of innovative teaching and learning. And one of the things that I discuss often is this idea of risk. And when we talk about risk, when we share this, risk is simply, I try to make it easier because we talk about this, but when we hear the term risk, we insinuate it as something dangerous, something, terrifying, and something we want to do. And so how I define it is risk is simply moving from a comfortable average in pursuit of an unknown better. And if you think about it in a personal context, right? Because we often talk about this professionally, but personally, we become risk averse as well. So I'm sure that many people, including myself, listening in right now, can identify a time that they stayed in a relationship way too long when they knew that wasn't working. And why do people stay? And a lot of time people stay because it's what they know, and they're terrified of trying something new. Even they will stick with the thing they know doesn't work because they're scared of something new. And so this idea also applies, you know, to what we do in teaching and learning. So a lot of times when we talk about teaching and learning, sometimes we will stick with things that we see are not working for students, yet actually are comfortable, you know, for teachers. And I'll give you an example of this. When I was in grade 3, I could tell you in grade 11 English class, we were going to read The Great Gatsby. And I'm sure many people that are listening, I'm not saying The Great Gatsby is bad, by the way. I know if there's English teachers here, they might get mad at me for this. This is not the point of this story. I could tell you in grade 3 that I was going to learn grade 11 because I had 2 older brothers. And a lot of times when we talk about some of the stuff we do in school, the reason why I knew it was going to be taught is because, and the teacher was great, by the way, it was more about what the teacher was interested in and what they were comfortable sharing. And then we already owned, you know, 100 copies of The Great Gatsby. But was The Great Gatsby really ever in the curriculum? And my guess is probably not. But there are certain things that we could have taught. But do we stick with things, like I said, because we know them and not even knowing who our students are? Or do we try to like continuously find new ways to ensure that we're doing things that are great for kids? And so before I get into this core divinity of teaching and learning, I do want to identify some things that I really believe shouldn't change, even though the context might change, and hopefully some things to think about in the work that we do. And so I always talk about these 4 non-negotiables for schools, and I'll give you some examples of each. So the first one is they're a welcoming and warm environment. And something to think about is that if I was to come to any of your schools for the first time, and I'm starting to do this as a parent, what do the signs on the walls tell me? What is the contact with your you know your first point of staff, maybe your admin team, your offices, and what does it say to me? And I'm sure many of you are familiar, Dr. Martin Brokenleg, when he worked with our school district, I remember him coming out and saying something that really stuck with me. And I'm sure many of you have seen a sign. He'll say, you see in many schools, there's a sign that says, for the safety of our children, please check in at the office upon arrival. So the first thing that you're insinuating to people as they walk into your building is kids are not safe. And the little distinction he made, which actually just sets a different tone, but is achieving the same outcome. He said, why could you not simply change the sign to, upon arrival, we love to welcome all visitors. Please come say hi at the office. So you're still asking people to share, but the tone of what, you know, is being shared when you walk into that room or walk into your school is really powerful. And so I remember one of the things that I noticed when I first became a principal at a school was when I walked in, my first day, I noticed that there was my office on the right, and it was all glass, and you could see everyone coming in. And to the left was the gymnasium, but above the gymnasium doors was the picture of every single principal who had ever served in that school since the beginning of time. And I don't ever remember a kid looking at those pictures and saying, you know, oh, that was the principal in 1972. That's absolutely amazing. Nobody cared, right? And I find it fascinating because we talk about kids being narcissistic because, you know, they take selfies, but, you know, principals were posting portraits of themselves on walls, but whatever, that's a whole other conversation. So I waited a few months before I even brought it up, and, you know, trying to take my own advice, really trying to get to know the staff. And I was asked by the secretary, I said, she's like, what are you gonna get your portrait for the wall? And I said, well, I'm not going up on that wall. She's like, we're the principal. I'm like, I know, but I'm not going up on that wall. So I talked to my staff and I shared with them that I felt really uncomfortable with those pictures and I wanted to change them. And what was really interesting was my staff pushed back on the idea. And when they talked about that idea, the first thing that many of them brought up was tradition. And one of my favorite quotes, it's not mine, so I don't want to attribute it to me, is tradition is peer pressure from dead people. And I think it's just one of the funniest lines ever. And I eventually talked them out of having those pictures, and we replaced them with what is so obvious. We replace them with pictures of kids in the building right now. And so when kids walk into schools, what is it telling them? Is it telling them this is about the adults, or is this about the students? And so I watch kids walk in and just be so excited they were on the wall, that they're seeing themselves represented. And I think a lot of times we show pictures of kids from like yesteryear, kids in this, early time. And, there's obviously a place for that. But are our students represented on those walls right now? And I think that's something that I look at. And so I challenge you. I know some of you are brand new, and I know some of you are probably more experienced, maybe been in your school for a while. When you go back to your schools the next day, I want you to look at around the walls, and I want you to look with what I call fresh eyes. Pretend it's your first day and try to experience this. What does the student see when they're walking around? What does our community see? So I think that's really important. The second one is they develop students as good people and learners. This is obvious, something we've done forever. But I think one of the things I address is how the context has changed, and how we need to recognize this. So probably many of you listening right now were probably drunk underage at some point, which I was, and I know many of you probably were too. Some of you probably, could be drinking right now. I don't know, right? It's part of the virtual meeting opportunity, right? So did anyone post that they were drunk on a social media or social network? Probably no, right? And probably not because you were really thoughtful of your future, but because those things didn't exist when we were kids. And so many of our kids are actually being held to a standard that many of us didn't live up to when we were kids. And so when I talk to students about this, the one thing they'll say to me is that it's not fair. And what I do is I agree with them. It's not fair. They're held, like I said, they're held to a different standard that we were. And so what I say is it's not fair, but you also have more opportunity than I ever did. So which one are you going to focus on? And so when we talk about things like social media, a lot of times it's like the don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, as opposed to like, here's this opportunity. Here's a way you could utilize this to create something that I didn't have access to. And so I think that's one of the shifts of thinking. The next one is they model the learning they expect from their students. So one thing I've suggested, and I don't know what you call them, I don't use them, to be honest with you. I think they're called learning norms, where we kind of set the norms for the day of how we're going to learn. And what I actually encourage people to do is, if you're going to use that, use this simple learning norm. Learn in a way you'd expect from your students today. And I think that a lot of times, if you think about your professional learning days, things like that, are you and your staff modeling the type of learning that you would like to see in your classrooms, right? Are we grabbing our phones and taking phone calls and walking out of the room when we would never be okay with a student doing that? And I'm actually not saying that I'd be against a student doing that. What I struggle with is when we act in a certain way for our time of learning, then we would not accept from our students. And I think that even having the conversation as well, what does that even mean? What does that look like? Would be really valuable. And something that really simple that I encourage you to share, encourage you to do, in this time, because the thing I always ask of people is that they like that, if you learned something new in the last 3 months, everyone has, right? But if I was asked the people you serve what you have learned new in the last 3 months, could they tell me, or do they not know? Do we ask people to take risks, yet they don't see us doing it ourselves? And so a really simple thing to do, many of you listening right now, I know you have social media, you're using Twitter, whatever. And so what I encourage you to do is, if you're sharing to the hashtag new admin, share to your school hashtag. Share some of the stuff you're learning and start those conversations with your staff so they can see what you're learning. And I think sometimes it's really powerful when we talk about things that we actually struggle with, so people see us struggling, because a lot of times they just see us get to the point, but they don't see the struggle to get there. And so I think that's a really important question. And so the last one I'll talk about is the idea of they stoke curiosity, not extinguish it. And really simple to me, do we encourage people to challenge us in the work that we do? And I'm talking about our staff or students, or do we just want them to accept everything we say? And one of the things I used to say to my staff all the time is this is not about your idea. This is not about my idea. It is about the best idea. We don't care where it comes from. So let's all work together and challenge one another so we get better for kids. So really creating that culture where we question and challenge ideas in pursuit of serving children and serving the students that we have. And so just kind of some ideas, some kind of traditional things, but understanding context is changing. And so I'm going to get into the core. I'm going to talk about each idea. And I have about 20 minutes or so to kind of get into this. And so, like I said earlier, the idea of innovation, it's not about stuff, it's really about a human endeavor. And so the 4 areas are relationships at the center, creating empowering learning experiences, learner-driven evidence-informed practice, and educators master learning. So I'm actually going to leave relationships for last because it is, to me, the most important one. And so I'm going to start with the idea of master learner, master educator. And this kind of ties it. And when we worked in Parkland School Division, when I worked at Parkland School Division, I apologize, we actually created a new mission and vision. And I think it's really powerful. I'm going to share it with you all. And just going to read to you quick. Parkland School Division is a place where exploration, creativity, and imagination make learning exciting, where all learners aspire to reach their dreams. Now, I'm really proud, and this is modeled in my district when I worked there, because I actually challenged the word that was there before, which was students. And so when we talked about it, well, I challenged it in the idea that why are we not saying learners? Because learners actually would include everybody. Where students actually, although it represents the largest part of our population, it's not all of it. So do we see ourselves in that vision? Do we see ourselves as we're getting to that space as well? And so I think that little shift in wording is really powerful to the work that we do, that we see ourselves early. And one of the misconceptions, especially when we're talking about the idea of innovation, is that, some of our older teachers are very stuck in their ways. And, once they move on and we get all these new, fresh, young ideas coming into our schools, that will soon become innovative. And what I've seen over and over again is that some teachers in their 30th, 35th, 40th year are some of the most innovative educators we have, where I'm seeing a lot of newer teachers become very traditional. And a gentleman named Bruce Dixon said something really powerful. He said, in no profession other than education do you watch someone do your job for 16 years before you go do it yourself. And many of our newer teachers teach the way they're taught. Like, for example, I'm sure you've said this or you've heard a teacher say it, the bell doesn't dismiss you, I dismiss you. This is not made up by anyone in this room that's listening to this. This is something that was said to you by a teacher, that was said to them by a teacher. You see these practices being passed down year after year after year. And so really kind of understanding that learning is about this mindset, and really thinking about always continually challenging our own thinking and the work that we do. And I spoke to a group yesterday, and one of the things that I challenged them with is that if you always act new, you will always be relevant. But the second you think you got everything down, that's when the trouble starts to happen. And so really understanding that learning is something that continuously changes, or the opportunities, change over time. And so how do we think about this? And so I identified these 3 areas that we talk about that are essential for the learning that we do as educators. And so the idea of learning for your students, learning about your students, and learning from your students. So learning for your students, obvious, you're doing this right now, right? You're learning to push yourself, to grow, to become better at what you do. This is one we do all the time. Learning about your students is, who are the kids in front of me? And I'll give you an example of like how I used to see this as, this was not really important. And like mentality of like, you're going to adjust to me, not the other way around. And so you've seen teachers that, they could tell you on May 10th at 10:30 a.m., this is where they'll be in math. And they don't know their kids, they've never met their kids, but the kids will get to that space by that time, as opposed to spending that time to connect and learn who they are. And one of the things I've suggested to teachers, and I always get a really interesting reaction to this, because we do complain we have no time, but then we create things that, take up a lot of our time, is the idea of, when teachers come back early to decorate their classrooms, and, they're beautiful, Pinterest ready, shared on Instagram. And what I've suggested to teachers is that don't decorate your classroom. Have it empty when kids walk in, and actually have a bunch of materials, and actually have the kids decorate the classroom as a relationship building activity. And you will see a lot of what's represented by those kids in the walls. But when you actually go into classrooms, they look beautiful, but they don't necessarily represent the students that are in that room. And I would rather see the imperfections of my child than the perfections of a teacher. And I think like finding those opportunities where we know our kids and we can start connecting with them. And I'll talk more about this, coming up soon. But the next one I talk about is the learning from your students. Do we create a culture in our classrooms where it's not just the students learning from the teacher, but it's the students learning from each other, but also, I think this is really important, the teacher learning from the students as well. And this idea that, when you look at the classroom as a whole, the intelligence as a whole, it's always smarter than any single teacher. But do we embrace that idea and embrace that thinking of the work that we actually do? And so just kind of thinking about these three concepts of, who our students are and actually how they connect. And so understanding that if you want to be a master teacher, you need to be a master learner, but you need to see that opportunities for learning change over time. And so how do we actually create that in the work that we actually do? So the next one I'll kind of tie into is the idea of learner-driven, evidence-informed practice. And there's a really distinct reason why I'm using the idea of learner-driven, evidence-informed practice. So the idea, one of the things that I hear in schools all the time is data-driven. And I don't think that any person using that term has bad intentions with the work that we do. But the idea of when we hear that, when many teachers hear that, what they hear is it's all about scores. It's all about getting results on the PISA or whatever, And we lost focus of like why many people have become teachers. And so I've really distinguished the idea of learner-driven, evidence-informed practice. So we are driven by the students in front of us, that this is who we support, and identifying them as individuals, but also using evidence to inform the work that we do. And I actually would say that many people who use the terminology data-driven, the terminology of learner-driven, evidence-informed practice is much more in line with their beliefs of what we do. And so it's not that I'm saying don't use data, but it's the idea of are we driven by numbers or driven by our students? Because I think the terminology matters to what our teachers are, not what we mean, but what our teachers are hearing. And I'll tell you, I bring this up often, and I say data-driven is the stupidest term in education. And I say it for effect, to be honest, and I get applause from teachers every single time, which shows you there is a pushback to this terminology. And so I think this terminology of learner-driven to evidence-informed practice is really crucial. And kind of going back to the other one is that when we talk about this learner-driven, who are the kids in front of me? Who are they? Kind of what drives them. And so please feel free to take a picture of this, screen capture, whatever. When I work with teachers and these 5 questions, and I know it's just to start the school year, you can use them at any point, obviously. If you know these things about your kids, what does it change in your work? What does it change in the ideas of what we do? And so when I made the comment earlier about The Great Gatsby, if you knew about me, when I was a kid, I loved basketball. You can see, I don't know if you can see the Kawhi Leonard. I was actually at the game. Kawhi Leonard comes back. I'm like so excited for that game tonight. But if you knew me, could you have met the curriculum requirements through having me read a book called The Jordan Rules? Could I have met the same curriculum requirements? And you'll see like one of the pushbacks when you talk about what are you passionate about, one of the pushbacks that you're seeing in education is with leveled readers is that many teachers are realizing that students will actually read at much higher levels when they're interested in the content than simply putting them at a level whether they care about the content or not. And so I think that utilizing these questions really helps us to kind of shape and shift, the work that we're actually doing with the students in front of us. And it doesn't mean that we tailor every single thing, because it's not realistic. But creating some of those opportunities, for our students, where it's based on what they're interested in and how they connect, really helps us, in the work that we actually do. And if we only talk about, and I'll talk more about this in the next part, because you'll see all these things are interconnected. When all we talk about is scores, and that's what we send out to the public, then that will make teachers teach to the test. That will make teachers teach to this, as opposed to focusing on learning. And the analogy that I always give is that if I can get a kid to do really well on any standardized test or whatever, that doesn't mean they're a learner. But if I can focus that kid on becoming a really good learner, they'll be fine on the test. And I think it's not about foregoing one for the other. It's actually understanding that it's more important to focus on the idea of learning, so the kids are successful after a time in school, so they're not just good at school, but can't figure out things on their own after. And so this ties into the third one, the idea of creating empowering learning experiences. And I'll use this, I'm going to share this real quick, and hopefully the audio works, and Matt, just tell me if it doesn't at the time. I don't know if I froze here.
You might have to full screen it, George. Yeah,
I will in a second. Okay. And so the idea of, kind of tying into the last one, knowing the students in front of you. So I have to teach a science curriculum. So this is a kid, and you can see, I'll show you this really quickly. This is a kid who is going to explain the concept of 0 calories. And I'm just going to show you this real quick and just see, do you believe the kid knows what they're talking about?
This is Splenda. It's known as a 0-calorie sweetener, or a healthy replacement for sugar.
Splenda no-calorie sweetener, with the original sugar-like taste you love and trust.
But hold up, wait a minute. How is this even possible? Have you ever thought to yourself it's a little strange that a food has 0 calories? Can it even have that? Well, yes, it's theoretically possible. Think of it this way. If you say eat plastic, nothing really will happen. Plastic has 0 usable calories. If you eat it, you can't take energy from it. Don't eat plastic, by the way. This is just an example.
The reason I show this video is kind of the idea of, you have this kid who's maybe wants to become a YouTuber, and I got to teach the science concept. And this is kind of the crux of the idea of innovate inside the box. So I have this student who wants to be a YouTuber. I got to teach the science curriculum. So what a lot of people hear is like, well, George talks about innovation, but we got to teach the curriculum. But what I'm trying to show is how you teach the curriculum is the innovation. So I understand that as a teacher, I need to teach the science concept. I know those questions, this kid wants to be a YouTuber. And what I'd say to the kid is like, hey, I know you want to be a YouTuber. Could you actually explain this concept, creating a science, a video about this in science? And so when we talk about the idea of evidence, this kid will be fine on any test they're, talking about this. And I think that's where we're shifting. But does the kid have actually ownership? Do they do this? Or do we ask kids to learn in a way, when we talk about authentic, a lot of times when we say the term authentic, we mean authentic to the teacher, not necessarily to the student. Knowing the kids in front of us is really about empowering. It's not just about them creating, which is a huge component of it, but do they have choice in, what they read, what they share? And I think that's one of the shifts that we talk about. And this is really simple. I know I'm short on time, so I'm just going to kind of rush through the last part. Is that when we talk about the idea of engagement, which you hear all the time, the easiest distinction, because I always talk about empowerment. I don't really touch engagement. And I'm not saying engagement's not important, but the easiest way I can explain this is that if you are engaged, it does not mean you're empowered. But if you are empowered, it is guaranteed you're engaged. And it takes it to a whole different level, because when our students leave our classrooms and they actually need us to learn, they need us to find their pathway, we actually haven't done our job. So it's really empowering them so that they're not only successful in the work that they do in school, but they're actually learn to be successful in the next phase of their lives. And so the last one I'm going to talk about, like I said, is the most important one, is the idea of relationships and what we create with this. And really, kind of all these things kind of talk about this concept of how we ensure that the kids are valued. Like, I've been challenging this quite a bit lately, is that we talk about the personalization of learning, but we standardize what success looks like. And so we need to really shift those things. And part of it is really like, what is success to the student? What are the goals of the student? These are really important aspects to share it. One of the things I talk about when we talk about this idea of relationships, and you can apply this to, you know, this teacher concept basically not just your teachers, but your staff, is I talk about this idea of school teacher versus classroom teacher. And I'll tell you, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, I never hired classroom teachers. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. A classroom teacher, to me, they can be great with their content, they can know their stuff inside out, they can like their kids, but when they walk out of their classroom, you're not my problem, go to the office. And I'll throw a number out to you. Probably about 90% of you, 90% of the referrals to your office are probably done by 10% of your teachers. Those are your classroom teachers. Now, a school teacher, on the other hand, they are great with the content, they know their kids, they walk out of the room, every student in that school is their child. And that's who we're looking for. And like I said, I'm not just talking about our teachers, I'm talking about our staff, that we're advocates for every single one of our kids, whether we interact with them or not. And or whether we teach them or not, sorry. And I actually recently worked with a student, and she shared a really powerful story from high school, grade 9 to 12. She had shared that she had suffered with depression, suicidal thoughts. And she said the one thing that actually kept her going every single day was a teacher who never taught her one class in his life, who every morning said hi to her and addressed her by her name. And she said that brought her life every single day, that it made such a difference just to be acknowledged and valued. And so I really struggle when I see an adult walk by another adult and a kid and not acknowledge them, not say hello in some way, because not only can that make a day, and that student proved it could save a life. And so we always err on the side of positive. And so I think this is really important to me. And this is a quote that's shared often. And it does really bother me, is that every child needs at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about him or her. Now, I understand the context of it is really important, but when you look at these ideas, when you think of how many years a student spends in school, how many adults they'll actually interact with, do we even believe one? Do we really believe one is enough? That all of us have to be advocates, whether it's custodians, our staff. Do we hire people that are relationship builders, that go out of their way to connect with all kids in the classroom, whether they teach them or not? Do they look at supervision as an opportunity to connect? And please feel free to take a picture of this or screen capture it. I share these ideas of like really simple ways of creating a classroom culture. And I'm not going to go over each one. I've just shared it for you to actually be able to capture the visual. What does this do for our students? And I'm sure many of you, when the school starts every day, you're outside your buildings welcoming students as they come in, which is a powerful investment of time, because you'll have much better interaction with the community, with your staff. But when you look at your school, if I was to come to your school and I was there to be at the opening bell tomorrow, would your teachers be at the door welcoming kids, greeting them, making them feel special they come in? Or is that something we just save for the first week of school or even the first day of school? And that isn't, like I said, it's an investment of time that will kind of come over and over again. And it's actually been shown that it actually helps, students to academically. And I know that it's more about academics, but they found like just greeting a kid at the door does make a significant difference in learning throughout the day. And so what happens there? And so how do we actually ensure that we focus on building these relationships every single time? And this is actually this is a good friend of mine, Tony Sinakis, is a principal. And a really powerful way that he used technology to build relationships and also connect with community, but really empower students as well. And I just want to show you this quick idea for a welcoming newsletter.
Hi, my name is Tony Sinanis, and I'm the lead learner here at Canning Elementary School, and I'm with a bunch of our awesome fifth graders because we are here for our second weekly update of the year, where we're going to tell you about what's going on in every grade level from kindergarten to fifth grade. So the kids here with us today are from Mrs. Cypress' class. I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
I'm Hunter. I'm Sophia.
I'm Charlotte. I'm Jeannie.
I'm Jack.
So Jack, Jeannie, Charlotte, and Sophia and Hunter are all here today because they're going to tell you a little bit about what's going on, starting with kindergarten. Hey, Charlotte, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in kindergarten?
The kinders are going book shopping for the first time. And they're also learning letter sounds and numbers 0 through 10.
Do you remember when you were in kindergarten, Charlotte?
No.
Oh, all right.
So you see that video and how powerful it is, and actually brought people together and actually empowered the kids. And you see Tony sitting right in the middle of those students. And that actually was in Ontario. I remember distinctly the board I was actually in. And one of the principals said to me, our parents will never go for this. And I said, I guarantee you can find 5 parents who would want this right away. You know what's going to happen the next week? A bunch of other parents will say, when is my kid giving me that video? And you see Tony working with the students, empowering them, you know, giving them an opportunity to share their voice and how powerful this is. And I just want to share this example because I think it's really, really powerful. And I'm going to end with this quote, and then I'll take any questions. Megan Lawson, a good friend of mine, educator in Ohio, she said, we don't have to be perfect to make a difference. We need to care deeply about our impact on our kids, care deeply about our words, and we need to embrace our humanness. And I think this is kind of the crux of everything that we do. So I'll share again that core, really focusing if you focus on these things, these 4 things, what difference will that make in your school? And so just want to share. But I have a couple of minutes. I know I don't want to keep anyone too long. I know everyone has busy lives, but if anyone has any questions, I'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to connect. So any questions you have?
So George, while we're waiting, we had one relating to that relationship piece you just spoke about. One participant's curious about encouraging teacher-student relationships that may be strained or challenged, and how do they support that rebuilding? So is there anything that you've done in the past or anything you've seen people use that would help in a situation like that?
Yeah, I think to be honest with you, a lot of times it's just when we don't address, and I think a lot of times when we try to convince people of other ideas, which is, I know that's not exactly the question, but it's the same context, is that what we do is we talk too much. And in the same way, what we should be doing is listening and understanding, like, you know, asking people, you know, asking our students, like, hey, like, what's up? How you doing? You know, like, and talking to them as people. And a lot of times it's so focused on that student-teacher dynamic as opposed to person-to-person dynamic. So I think it's just really about listening. And like a little tip that I've shared with administrators, and hopefully this helps you, is that whenever students were sent to my office, there's 2 questions I would ask them. And I would never say, I know you did this, blah, blah, blah. So when they're in trouble, I'd ask these questions. Why are you here? And the reason I'd ask that is because I want them to hear their own voice. I don't want to say, hey, so this teacher told me this, 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 and this, and, you know, I have an issue, blah, blah, blah. I want them to hear it themselves. And the mentality is that a lot of times when we talk with our students and we say, you did this, this, and this, you're acting like a police officer giving a ticket, you know, and the first thing people think when the officer drives away is like, that person's a jerk. And so we want the kid to take ownership, hear their own voice, so they're talking. The second thing that we say is, after they explain why they're here, what would you do if you were me? And actually helping kids build those, you know, kind of share like what they believe would be a good process, process or consequences or whatever, however you want to term it, you know, and actually using those 2 questions really to know this, because I think a lot of times there is, you know, you did this, and then we wonder why kids don't like us or why we have a bad relationship. So I think really putting our kids in opportunities where they are the one leading conversations not only is beneficial for our relationships, but it's actually teaching kids how to actually identify things that they've done and actually how do they actually make us better moving forward. So hopefully that kind of helps you get some answers. You know, obviously every relationship is different. So, you know, the situation is probably very unique to what is being shared, but hopefully that helps in some way. Thanks everybody. Really appreciate all the chat. Thanks for spending extra time learning today for your community. It really means a lot.